Good afternoon. The Finance Committee meeting for the Gary Common Council for June 12, 2019 is now called to order. On this evening's agenda are 3 ordinances and 1 resolution. CPO 2019-36, which is an ordinance of the Common Council of the City of Gary authorizing the issuance of the City of Gary, Indiana Economic Development Tax Increment Revenue Bond, Series 2019 U.S. Steel Corporation project, and the provision of the proceeds thereof to U.S. Steel Corporation, and authorizing and approving other actions in respect thereto, sponsored by the Gary Economic Development Commission. CPO 2019-38, an ordinance revising 2019 appropriations for the general operating budgets for the fiscal year beginning January 1, 2019, and ending December 31, 2019, sponsored by Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson, City of Gary, Angela Hayes, City Controller. CPO 2019-39, an ordinance appropriating 2019 budgets for the operating expenses and salaries of grants and special revenue funds for the Commission of Women and Health and Human Services of the City of Gary for the fiscal year beginning January 1, 2019, and ending December 31, 2019, sponsored by Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson and Angela Hayes, City Controller. CPR 2019-05, a resolution of the Common Council of the City of Gary, Indiana, approving certain matters in connection with the establishment of an economic development area and allocation area, and the approval of an economic development plan for said area, sponsored by Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson and the Gary Redevelopment Commission, Gary Plan Commission. We're going to, let me introduce to you this evening who's present. We have Councilwoman Linda Barnes Caldwell, Councilwoman of the 5th District, Councilman Herb Smith, Councilman at Large, Councilman Mike Brown, Councilman at Large, Councilman Ron Brewer, Councilman at Large and Council President, Councilwoman Rebecca Wyatt, Councilwoman for the 1st District. We have our Council Legal Advisor, Attorney Renzo Williams, and our Council Financial Advisor, Mr. Virgil Moore. We are going to, for those of you who have an agenda, we're going to take the agenda out of order. We're going to begin with CPO 2019-38. We're going to take 2019-38, 2019-39, then CPO 2019-36, and CPR 2019-05. So we're ready. We can begin CPO 2019-38. Thank you.
Yes, good evening. What I have before you today is a change in the finance department budget. What I'm looking to do is moving the salaries from the empty deputy controller position and the fringe benefits into the professional services line item to give me the added assistance that I'm needing right now to be able to move forward on financial projects that need to happen.
Questions, comments, council members? Nobody have any questions? Comments?
No.
Everybody straight?
Madam Chair?
I asked for council members. I'll get to the public afterwards. None of you guys. Everybody's okay, Mr. Moore? Okay. All right, Mr. Nowacki.
Yes, I was going to ask, is the amount of the transfer, is that equal to the total amount of compensation, including benefits, et cetera, that's being transferred, or is it an amount different than what would be the position's total compensation, including all benefits and other expenses for that position?
Yeah, you can.
Okay. This is actually the general fund salary and the salaries that are associated with those benefits. There is a GST part that is not part of this.
So
budget.
the amount being transferred is
the general fund salary portion and those attached benefits.
with the attachment. And will that be the same amount? Is that going to be the same amount that In other words, are the two numbers the same number?
Yes,
Yes.
I'm taking 70,600 from
Right.
personnel services and moving that to professional services.
And what about like FICA and?
That is included, yeah,
That's included.
7,000.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Is that it? Nobody else have any questions or comments? Okay. CPO 2019-38.
Thank you. In front of you are two different grant budget revisions. The first one is for Commission of Women. Mrs. George is here to explain her requested changes.
Have it. Thank you.
She said 38, but maybe it's 39.
39. We on 39?
We're on 39.
I'm sorry, we're on 39, yeah. I'll be all right. Okay, 39.
Good evening, Madam Chair and all the members of the committee. Before you is a revision to a grant at our social services block grant, Department 3870. The grant cycle is October 1st, 2018 to September 30th, 2019. The original amount is $8,000. The incorrect budget was inadvertently submitted last cycle, so the correct budget should have reflected $500 in household supplies, $2,000 for printing materials, which includes education and outreach. And then the allocation for repairs was not supposed to be in this line item, or part of this budget. And those are the changes that you see on the revised budget.
Okay. Questions, council members? Comments?
Bottom line just didn't change it.
No.
Bottom line did not
those
change.
numbers. Okay.
Right.
Question, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Have any of these proceeds been expended already?
No, we just got these budgets approved.
Okay, all right.
So we don't have to do.
You don't need to ratify.
Right, we don't have to ratify them. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Mr. Moore? Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you. There's also the health
Another
department.
part.
I'm sorry.
Second page. Sorry.
Another part.
Okay. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. The health department has received additional grant funds for their emergency preparedness and are requesting an increase in the budget based on those new grant funds. For $15,459, they are requesting that to go into their professional line, services line item. So it would increase the budget by $15,459 to $77,250.
Madam Chair,
Mm-hmm.
what was the professional services in detail?
I have a representative from the health department that can answer that specific question.
And what was the question?
What was the,
Professional services, the
yes,
15,459.
the line item for professional services? What is that in detail?
Professional services, that would be the salaries for the fiscal agent, the transportation, and myself, the coordinator.
So this was a grant you all was waiting to receive, or?
This will be our new grant starting July 1st. And so we receive additional funds for new projects that are coming up for the new deliverables.
So this is just part-time for somebody?
Yes.
On a contractual basis.
Oh, okay.
So there's no taxes or any of those type of costs for the city,
For the part-time of this?
for the positions in the professional.
Positions of contract.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Any more questions? Comments? From the public? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, are we ready? The next item is CPO 2019-36. I don't know, are we ready for that one now? I don't know who's doing the overview for that one.
Madam Chair, move that recess until the mayor can get down here to,
I'll second it. Okay.
Sorry.
is.
We're just gonna
who's
take a brief
We're gonna take a
recess until
recess
you're ready.
until the mayor get here,
Okay.
if she's ready, 36.
Okay. The Finance Committee meeting for Tuesday, January 12, 2019 has now reconvened. On the agenda, CPO 2019-36 and CPR 2019-05. So we will begin with CPO 2019-36. Mayor? Hi.
First and foremost, let me say thank you to the council for your patience, as well as to the members of the public. I want to also thank you for allowing us to be a little more extensive with this presentation. I'm going to give you some documents. We are trying to get this up, and we will, but as we're doing that, we want to continue because we don't want to prolong the time.
Okay.
So this is,
Thank you.
what I want to do is really just kind of provide some context. Just use another thumb drive. For what we are doing today. And for the last year, we have been in the process of implementing measures that are really related to 2 to 3 years of work of looking at our finances in detail, determining what measures need to be taken to rectify them. It occurred to me during the last council meeting that because it has taken, it's been done over a 3-year period, there are some questions because people haven't been at every meeting. So I asked the president and finance chair for permission to bring it all together in a presentation. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to, one, look at the current financial state of the city. You know, we're not going to give a whole lot of historic context. Everybody knows about depopulation. Everyone knows about the reduction in property taxes. Everyone knows about the reduction in gaming revenue, the reduction in AV. Everyone knows about those challenges. What we're going to really talk about is what do the numbers look like? What are the current, what is the current revenue? What is it in the historical context? Given what the revenue is, what are the projections? We were very fortunate to get a grant 2 years ago that allowed a financial company to come in and to help us with projections based on the revenue that and expenses in 17 and 18, and then to look at 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. So you'll see that today. We'll also look at what happens if there is no sale leaseback, there is no U.S. Steel transaction, and we're here to talk in detail about U.S. Steel because that's the ordinance that we're talking about. And then what happens if there is only one and not the other? You know, what does that look like in terms of finances? And ultimately, what happens if we do nothing? We will also get a review of the financial recovery plan that has been in place for really the last year. And the success that we've seen, some of the challenges that we've seen, how that happens into 2020, even though we are not here, and make the case as to why that should continue to happen. It doesn't tie anyone's hands. In fact, it creates a financial foundation from which the next mayor can actually really do some things that have not been available over the last 8 years and that have not really, it creates a budget, a balanced budget that hasn't existed, quite frankly, for the last 15 years because of the reduction in property taxes. And so what's going to happen and the way it's going to happen is that Curtis Whitaker is going to provide the financial overview. Dana is going to Dana Bennett is going to give you the implementation of the financial recovery plan. Joe is going to talk about the U.S. Steel transaction. During his presentation, I want to, because I know that Paul Vercher and CJ from EY is here. So we'll give you an opportunity to ask any questions while Joe is making that presentation. And then Brandon will talk about the sale leaseback, and certainly we'll take any questions that you have. So again, I appreciate your indulgence. Sorry that the technology is technology and is not operating, but we should have it up for everybody to see shortly, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to do this. And what I'm ultimately hoping, and I do want to thank all of the elected officials who are here and the members of the public who responded to the invitation. I appreciate you being here, because I think that things are critical enough and important enough that everyone who serves the city and who is connected with the city know that. So with that, I'm going to sit down and ask Curtis to join us first.
Thank you, Mayor, Madam Chair, and members of the council. You have on page 4 projections or forecasts for the city. It starts with year 2017 and goes out to year 2023, and it shows all of the revenues and all of the, and it's also here on this slide here, it shows all of the revenues and all of the expenses of the city. This is what happens if the city does nothing. So you'll see we're in 2019. We're estimating about $26 million of property tax revenue, 20 million of tax anticipation warranties. Do that for us. $48 million in total taxes. We have all of our revenue sources here for each of the years. You see $1.3 million in total licenses and permits, fines and fees of $180,000, other charges for services of $571,000. Next slide, please. And it just lists all of the revenue sources that the city receives. You see we're estimated to receive in 2019 $72,882,640 in the general fund. And each of these years, as you see, the revenue increases in this year and then decreases here and goes up slightly in other years. Go to the next slide. Now we look at expenses. It talks about personnel expenses or labor costs, $42 million. Other services and charges, about 7.1. We have supplies, 688,000, and then loans that we have to repay, temporary loans we have to repay, interfund transfers and the like, 58 million. So we did nothing. Thank you. Next page. We did nothing in 2019. We would end the year at 42.5 million dollars in the red. And it was just, as you can see, this is 2019, 2020, we'd be 47.4, 2021, 51 million, 2022, 54.7 million. It just grows. The deficit of the city just continues to grow if the city does nothing. But we've been looking at and working over the last several years, quite honestly, to, as we saw this approaching, trying to understand what it is that the city could do so that the city does not have to be in this position. Next slide, please. And so we have come up with what we call this full recovery measure. And the full recovery measure, next slide, please, it includes, this is sort of small, but you'll see in 2019, the other slide, it was about $26 million. Now it's $41.2 million. That includes the U.S. Steel advance that why we're here tonight, and what we'll talk a little bit about later. And so because that advance our property tax collection this year will go from 26 to 41 million. It's $15 million we're expecting to receive. All these other revenue sources, most of them stayed flat. So we don't believe that there is, we were being very conservative with our revenue projections, not want to overestimate revenues. And we were really robust with the expenses of the city, suggesting that, you know, we want to be conservative on revenue. If they come in higher, great, and more robust with expenses, and hopefully we can get them lower. And get the next slide, please. So here, our revenue, and including the sale leaseback transaction, which the mayor talked about last week and the council voted on, with that $30 million and the $15 million U.S. deal. This year, total revenues will be $120 million. We have our expenses, $41 million in personnel expenses, $5.4 million in other services and charges, $563 in total supplies, and let's see, $63.8 million. What this allows us to do, in the other slide, we had $41 million here. It allows us to repay TAWs that we borrowed at the beginning of this year. As you know, each year the council administration comes before the council for authority to borrow tax anticipation warrants there and anticipation of property taxes. And so this year we would have paid $41 million, paid off last year's that we had to roll over into this year, and we would have paid off the monies that we borrowed this year. We also borrowed in March $8 million in anticipation of this sale leaseback transaction, this $40 million transaction that Brandon will talk some about a little bit later. With all of these things combined, we're able to do a number of things. You can go to the next slide. Our picture now changes. $112,000 of expenses, and our net, what I call net income, revenues over expenses, net surplus, is now $7.4 million. You'll see every year going out is now positive because of the sale leaseback transaction, but also because of some of the things that Dana is going to talk about with the cost recovery plan. All of these things yield us the ability to pay off short-term debt. $8 million worth was borrowed in March, $20 million of which was borrowed in January. It also helps the city, as you can see, over the last several years, and if we go back further than that, the city has been in a negative cash position. Last year, we ended the year at 7.3 negative. The year before that, 9.3 negative. This gives the city the ability to end cash with a positive cash position. Another thing I will point out is total capital expenses. This line item, as you can see, barely spending anything in the general fund on CapEx. This gives about $9.7 million this year and over the next 4 years to spend on capital expenses, repairing streetlights, technology improvements and gains and the like. And talk some more about that. With 1.8 of that being available this year. So this accomplishes a number of things, gets us in a positive ending cash position. The next administration will come in with cash, and then with the ability to do a tax anticipation warrant. You can't get around it. Do the warrant to get through the first 4 to 5 months before you get a tax draw, and give the administration the ability to do that. In 2020 also is $5 million of sale leaseback proceeds that are available in 2020. But this does a number of things for the city. It allows us to pay off, again, the short-term debt that we have. $9 million, actually it's $16 million. Can you go up? Okay, back, yeah. To loans, because in our loans we'll continue to pay off the loans that we have. Embedded in here are loan repayments of about $16 million over the next, this year, the next 4 years. Also included in here is the sale leaseback payment, $3.5 million, which Brandon will talk more about, that's going to be repaid. And all of this happens with the city being in a positive cash position at the end of each year with a net, to the back, last side of the with a net ending cash position, positive and growing, with a net surplus or net income in each of the years, the ability to pay off the loan, the ability to pay off the sale leaseback transaction, and the ability to do some CapEx that, quite frankly, hasn't happened in the city in the general fund in a long time. That's the state of where things are if the city does nothing, and what happens with the U.S. Steel investment as well as the sale leaseback transaction. Now Dana's going to come and she's going to share some of the initiatives that go along with these projections.
Good evening, everyone. As the mayor and Curtis talked about, there's a group of us, both staff, elected officials, and even private citizens that have been working on a financial recovery plan starting at the end of 17, and the implementation began in 18. The point of that financial recovery plan is to reduce our deficit to 0 over 3 years. What we knew, because of the continued decline in property tax revenue, the continued decline in casino revenue, if we did nothing, what we could expect is a continually growing deficit, which would not be manageable within a year or two. So we had to turn that tide, and part of what we wanted to focus on is initiatives that would help us eliminate that deficit altogether. So we used the projection document that Curtis just went over to determine what it will take to get us to the point where we did not have a deficit, and we came up with a variety of initiatives to get us to where we need to be. So the financial recovery plan is a living, growing document. When we started this effort in the end of 17, the document does not look like what it looks like today. What we did is vetted some ideas of what might work, both on the revenue enhancement side and the reduction of expenses side. As we vet those initiatives out, we knew that some of them would likely generate the kind of revenue or reduction in expenses that we had hoped. We realized that some of them would not. So we've added and removed initiatives as we continue to vet them. Right, as of today, we have 35 initiatives outstanding. We meet every week to track and review where the initiatives are to ensure that we're continuing to keep on track for our financial recovery plan. And we have these indicators to help us keep track of those items. So of the 35 initiatives, 25 of them, the implementation and or financial targets are on track. So each initiative has a dollar amount associated with it. For instance, I'll give you an example. EMS fees. We did an assessment of all of our fire fees, including EMS, to compare it to industry standards and to identify ones that we had not been charging that other communities charged, and did an ordinance earlier in the year to update our fee schedule, anticipating that that would generate additional revenue for us. We track the monthly amount of revenue we receive from EMS fees and compare it to last year to ensure that we're on track to meeting the target that we set for the year. There are about 6 that are either slightly behind schedule or the financial targets are slightly behind where they need to be. So these are areas that we want to have the related department heads focus on to ensure that we that we get on track or exceed our target amounts. And then there are 3 where either the implementation is further behind than we deem acceptable, or the financial targets are not where they need to be. Now, the ones in these 3 items, either we can focus the resources to get them on track, or we may identify 1 or 2 that says we're not going to get to that point. We're going to take that initiative off our program and look for others to roll into the financial recovery program. And I'll show you one example. There's one example right now out of these 35 that we're ready to remove because it is not meeting the financial targets And the dollar amount is not even here because we removed the dollar amount from this 15.4 because it was off track. Just one more thing. I just did another breakdown of the initiatives. 16 of the initiatives are based on enhancing revenue. 16 of the initiatives are based on reducing expenses. And 3 of the initiatives are based on one-time cash infusions. The one-time cash infusions is not a part of the 15 million because this we expect to achieve year after year. The one-time cash infusions are, as the name suggests, we'll get them one time, but it will just allow for an immediate cash infusion, but won't repeat itself every year. So this is just kind of a view of a portion of the project tracking document. It lists the initiatives in bold and then kind of the steps necessary to get us to the point where the initiative will be fully implemented. Each initiative has a lead assigned to it and a time frame for completion to help us track and keep track of our process. Joe is now going to talk about the U.S. Steel transaction and what that will mean for the city.
Sure. Sort of the reason for the evening is there are 2 ordinances. You have the 2 in front of you. One is a corollary to the Economic Development Commission allowing for a bond transaction to take place. The other is the establishment of a TIF district to pledge revenue toward that bond issuance. So real quick, our discussions with U.S. Steel started well over a year ago when they were talking about making some investments into a tin mill. And given the sort of non-existent, frankly, relationship over many years, we used it as an opportunity to re-engage. U.S. Steel has been really great about coming back to the table and discussing not just that, but potentially other investments as well. We have Paul from U.S. Steel and CJ here from Mercer Young to talk about that if you have questions in a moment. But by and large, we landed at an agreement that we thought was in our mutual best interest. This isn't a standard tax abatement. This isn't a TIF deal where all the bond goes back to paying off the project. We thought, how can we both benefit in a way that's meaningful, not just in terms of finances, but in terms of establishing a formal relationship with U.S. Steel going forward? And how can we do it in a way that's creative, given our current financial status? So, real briefly, I'll go over sort of the larger details of the agreement, and then maybe we can open it up a little bit. It's a 25-year term. Again, we have both a TIF being established and then funds from that TIF going toward the project. It's a $750 million investment by U.S. Steel that retains about 3,800 jobs at $27 an hour. As part of the agreement, each year U.S. Steel will also put money into a community benefit fund between $50,000 and $100,000, depending on the income generated that year. And there's also, again, a formalized relationship that's established through a project agreement that says exploration of serving on boards and commissions, discussing excess land that U.S. Steel might have for repurposing and redevelopment. Talks about participation in blight elimination, and again, serving on boards and commissions. So just mechanically, the way it would work is the city would create a TIF district, and simultaneously U.S. Steel would make a $20 million upfront cash payment to the city. That would be distributed with $15 million going to the city of Gary itself, $4 million going to the school district, and $1 million going to the library board, and that's upfront. They'll make a $750 million investment at minimum by 2022, and that'll result in roughly $51 million in tax increment per projections. Via the bond agreement and the development agreement, any taxes paid by U.S. Steel, and only those incremental taxes paid by U.S. Steel, go back to make them whole on the $20 million bond agreement. So all the risk is on them. The cost of bond issuance is on them. If the project stops for whatever reason, if U.S. Steel ceases to exist for whatever, if anything happens, that $20 million is still in the city's coffers. The only way that U.S. Steel can recover the cost is by sharing in the increment revenue thereafter. After that $20 million is returned, via, again, only the pledged increment, the city received 45% tax increment going forward after that $750 million. U.S. Steel, again, assumes all the risks. and if they do not generate enough increment to cover the bonds, they take the loss, not the city. If the city does nothing, again, you lose that $20 million cash infusion, and as we saw, that's critical at this point. We would receive significantly less in taxes, right, because it doesn't lock in anything beyond the minimum investment that they've committed already. There'd be no community development fund, the relationship would no longer be formalized, and there'd be no incentive to continue the relationship or investments in the flagship operation of U.S. Steel. A $750 million investment, again, that's the minimum we're looking at, again, would generate about $51 million. If it was a 50-50 split, if we shared in it, it would be $25.5 million. This way, we would generate about $22.5 million, and for the $2.5 million that's lost, the city gets $20 million up front, which is a very good rate. It's probably less than you pay on your credit card or your car note. So those are the mechanics of what's being proposed here. Again, it would be a TIF district that would be established, the funds of which would go to a share in the tax revenue, and as a benefit of that, we get $20 million up front. We have, again, Mr. Gersher and CJ from Ernst & Young to discuss any specifics of the investment or the AMP project in general, and Curtis, Dana, the Mayor, and I are all here to answer the questions you might have.
So we also, the next one, I think it's maybe a little out of order. Yeah, keep going down. This is the deal still included. So we're going to show just a scenario of what it looks like without this U.S. Steel investment. Keep going.
Well, that, I didn't put it without it, I just put it with it.
It's there.
Oh,
It's below.
okay.
Yeah, and so if the U.S. Steel, let's go back that one. The U.S. Steel investment, this, while we're here today, is not acted on. Before, this was $41 million, now it's $26 million. That's a $15 million infusion that the city would not receive. That's really the only thing we can go down. It's really the only thing that's changed. You'll see we had positive income before, and now we in 2019 again back in the red with 14. This was a small dollar value. Remember the dollar amount, maybe $50,000 of positive cash at the end of 2019. Now we're 14.9 and $15 million of negative ending cash and a negative a net loss at the end of the year, and our ending cash doesn't change. And so and this ending cash carries forward for the next year. If you get a TAW, you get it for $20 million. That's 20 minus 14, 15. That's $5 million to operate. That's 1 month worth of operating expenses for the city. And so by the end of January in 2020, the city would be out of cash with no additional ways to obtain cash. So that's what happens if the U.S. Steel advance. It does not happen. Brandon's going to come now, and he's going to share about the sale leaseback.
Good afternoon,
Good evening.
Madam Chair, Council, members of the public. So, as everyone that spoke previously mentioned, as the financial recovery plan was being developed, we saw that a gap existed, and the only way to fill that gap and allow the city the time that it needed to execute the financial recovery plan would be to borrow enough capital that would provide sufficient revenue over that 3-year period. And that's how we actually came up with the dollar amount of $40 million that will be necessary to borrow. Then looking at the laws here in Indiana, we had to come up with how can we actually borrow this $40 million, right? We couldn't just do it as a basic general obligation bond. We had to do what's called a sale leaseback, which sounds a lot more complicated than it is. So I'm going to try my best to really simplify it and say that the Gary Building Corporation is an entity that has been created by the city. The people who are appointed to the board are appointed by the council. And it exists for the sole purpose of owning city facilities and leasing them back to the city. So I just want to start there with the fact that there isn't a loss of control of the public safety building, right? But by creating or reinstating the Gary Building Corporation and transferring the public safety building to it, that allows this transaction to take place. We only did that because that's the only legal method that we had in order to borrow the amount of money that we needed. So, recognizing that we could borrow $40 million, we then had to determine how could we repay $40 million? What revenue streams does the city have that are stable and that investors would feel comfortable with that would repay the $40 million that's being borrowed? And the two revenue streams that we identified were the LIT, the local income tax, as well as the casino local development agreement revenue. Now, the LIT generates about $4.7 million per year. And the casino local development agreement generates about $6 million per year. So we then pulled together an RFQ. So we had an idea of how we could borrow the $40 million, but we wanted to put it out to the market, talk to as many underwriters as possible, get their responses. So we developed an RFQ that we sent out to 19 investment banks as well as several commercial banks. Of those 19 investment banks that we sent the RFQ to, 9 responded. And once we got the responses, we developed a Dropbox folder. We gave the council members access to review all of the proposals. We summarized the proposals and presented that here at Finance Committee for everyone to review, and then made a recommendation of an underwriter to execute the transaction based on the lowest cost in their proposal. After that, we went out to the market with a little bit different structure. And I want to highlight that because our very first structure that was presented to this body was LIT and LDA. However, based on the responses that we got back from the underwriters, one felt very confident that they could get the deal done using just the LIT. And so that is what then came before this body based on their belief they could get it done with just that one revenue stream. That was unsuccessful, right? We went out to the market. There was a ton of headline risk. There was just risk that wasn't willing to be taken with that structure. And so we said, well, what if we add the LDA? And that particular firm was not able to come back with any offer that would have been acceptable to the city, right? So at that point, we began working with several entities and in best efforts to see who could get this transaction across the finish line. And what we kept hearing from the marketplace was that they needed to believe in the recovery plan. They needed to believe in some of the initiatives that were being taken. And we started to get a lot of positive traction because we had the U.S. Steel announcement, companies announcing that they were going to relocate into the city. And so a lot of the negativity was starting to curtail, and some of the things that we were telling the marketplace was happening, they were able to see and validate that was happening in the city. And so we ultimately began working with Wells Fargo, who said, we feel very strongly that we can help this transaction be successful, and we are committed to helping the city find a buyer at terms that would be acceptable to the city. And so with that, the same structure that we had, which is pledging the local income tax and pledging the LDA, we would borrow $40 million over a 20-year period, right? Those bonds can be repaid in 10 years. So we're not fixed in it for 20 years. They can be repaid early at 10 years. The interest rate will have a approximate coupon of about 6%, with the total yield being around 6.3. Now, what does that mean? That means that over 20 years, you're gonna pay a debt service payment of about $3.5 million per year, right? Now, as I stated before, the LIT by itself currently generates about $4.7 million and has been trending up every year. So that one revenue stream should be more than sufficient to repay this debt. And so anything that's received of that 4.7 over the 3.5 debt service every year comes back to the city for general operating purposes, right? So you pay the 3.5 million for debt service. The extra 1.2 or whatever that overage is, you continue to use to operate as you have. That means you never touch the LDA payment for that year, and you still have that $6 million to operate in the general fund as well. Pledging those two revenue streams does not mean you lose those revenue streams. Those are just the two revenue streams that have been identified that can be used to repay this debt. The other sort of, I guess, upside, if you will, from the city's perspective is that means it's not really a general obligation. The repayment is tied only to those two revenue streams. So property taxes can't be raised or utilized to repay this debt, or any of the other revenue streams of the city. It's limited to those two particular revenue streams. One other difference is that there is or will be a first lien on the public safety building, or a mortgage on the public safety building. Now, what does that mean? In the event that for some reason this $11 million in revenue, $10.7 million in revenue that we identified falls below 3.5 million, and the city has no ability to repay, then the bondholders have a lien on that building, just like a mortgage on your house. I've heard it stated, and you're accurate. Right now, that building is not worth $40 million, meaning it's not. So why would a bondholder want it, right? If they take that building, it's not because they're going to take it and sell it for $40 million. The purpose of the facility is it's an essential use facility, right? Yeah, we have all of our police, courts, clerk's office. It's a necessary part of the city, which means you can't move all of those people anyplace else. And so because the bondholders are tied to a lease, they just want to make sure that you're going to stay in the facility that they're leasing. And so that's the purpose of the mortgage on the facility. It's not because you're looking to have, and the reality is, if you were to build a facility of about similar size, it would cost somewhere around $40 million, right? It's a huge complex. We can't house all of those people and build something and move them without incurring a similar cost of about $40 million. So that's the purpose of the mortgage on the facility. And again, something being triggered, bondholders don't get anything out of trying to kick a municipality and police and fire out of a public safety. One, they don't want the headline risk. No one wants to kick police out of the building. So I think some of the concerns that I've heard regarding that, hopefully that addresses those concerns. The cost of the transaction and the debt service reserve fund So a debt service reserve fund is cash that's set aside at closing in the event that you don't have money to make a debt service payment, right? So you pay debt service every 6 months. If for some reason the city doesn't send in that payment, it's late, or whatever, you already have a pool of cash that's sitting there that they can pull that payment from. And then when the city mails the payment in, it just goes back into that reserve fund. So it's really there to ensure the timely payment of the bonds in the event that the payment's not made. For this on a typical transaction, the reserve fund is usually equal to about 1 year's debt service. So in this instance, you would have a $3.5 million reserve fund. However, the terms we were able to negotiate is that we would only have to fund half of that. So as opposed to a $3.5 million debt service reserve fund, you're only looking at about a $1.75 million debt service reserve fund. So what does that mean? You're not borrowing more money to sit to the side. Now, that money is not sitting idle for 20 years, right? That money is invested. And the interest that investment makes goes towards the debt service. So if debt service is $3.5 million, if that $1.5 million that's invested generates $50,000 a year or whatever that number is, that means that the debt service the city pays goes down from $3.5 million to $3.45 million, or whatever that the amount of interest that's generated is. So it's not just sitting idle by. The other cost, if you will, to the transaction is cost of issuance, which are the fees and things that are paid to the various professionals, for the transaction. Right now, that number is estimated to be around 1.1 or 1.2 million, which is south of, probably just south of 3%. And I can say that for transactions, you typically see on what I would call a normal transaction, somewhere you're trying to be around somewhere around 2%. This transaction has certainly been a little unique, and it requires additional counsel because we're doing it on a tax exempt basis, right? So because we are borrowing this money on a tax exempt basis for long-term working capital, it requires additional counsel and additional opinions. The benefit of that is our interest rate is lower than it would be if we sold the bonds on a taxable basis. So even though there's a small amount of increase in the cost of issuance, it reduces the overall amount that the city will pay because we can do it on a tax exempt basis versus a taxable basis. The total repayment over the 20 years would be approximately $67.2 million. Remember, you borrowed 40, so that means in interest, it's about $27 million that you would repay. Assuming you let the bonds remain out for 20 years. No one knows what interest rates are going to do. If I had that crystal ball, I'd be doing something a little different. But the thought is that the city will be in a much better financial position, and therefore your credit will be better, and then you will be able to refund those bonds at a lower interest rate, right? Assuming rates don't skyrocket, and all indications right now are that that's not currently the case. So, built into the projections, however, we've left the debt service at $3.5 million. If you refund the bonds and the debt service goes down, that just increases the net income that Curtis showed you and helps the city operate in more of a surplus. So, with that, I think I was back last. I was the cleanup guy. But if there are any questions regarding the sale leaseback in particular, or to any other members of the team, we would certainly address those.
Questions? Any council members?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I just want to make a comment and thank you all for doing this presentation because I think it brings a lot of light for people to really understand how important it was for the council to act the way they were and how important it is for the city to move forward financially in this manner. And I hope that the general public and others will see the importance of what you all have presented to us. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
I just have a couple of points that I want to make before we close out. Certainly want to give the folks from U.S. Steel an opportunity to address anything that you need to hear from them. But the first thing that I want to do is just thank all who came. We have representatives from U.S. Steel. We have folks from Wells Fargo here, from Preston Hollow, and they're connected with the sale-leaseback. So we appreciate their presence because it shows their commitment. This isn't their first time here. They came to tour to see what was going on here in the city. The other thing that I want to say that this finally solves the DUAB dilemma. 10 years ago, DUAB brought a financial manager here, PFM.
Right.
And they said, you'll have relief for 3 years and we'll help you get all of your costs within the projected revenue that you will receive as a result of the tax caps. That didn't happen. And while they had some great ideas, the merging of the sanitary district tax allotment into the city, there were some changes. Revenue went down, depopulation occurred, collection rate was lower. So there were some things that they didn't anticipate. We've now seen a stabilization. In fact, we know that the property rates are up. We've seen it in the 1st district and in the 6th district. So it's not just in one part of the city. And so we know that revenue will be up. We've seen not just U.S. Steel's investment, but investment by others that will add to this, to the positive swing in the revenue. So I want you to know about that. We have been using TAWs essentially as a financing option. Now we can use them as they are intended to be used for tax flow. So you take a TAW out at the beginning, you pay it back, and there's no problem going forward. I also want you to look at, I believe it's the 4th page in, the cost, because there are a couple of cost items that I want, or expense items I want to turn your attention to. It says that travel and education is, I believe, 1.2 million. That actually incorporates postage and one other item. Telephone and postage. Travel is actually only $70,000 annually, and that incorporates everything that comes out of the general fund with regard to travel. So that really reflects the fact that the only time that the executive branch staff has traveled has on the general fund has been a result of required travel. Police have required training, health department has required training, there are others that have required training. I know the council has minimized its own travel. So you're looking at a total of $70,000 in travel and education, and the majority of that line item is, in fact, the telephone and postage expense. And then the other thing that I want you to know is that we kind of drilled down to see what was the lion's share of consultants' payments. It's legal, it is engineering, because there are engineering requirements that are associated with some of the capital projects that we've been involved in, the Green Link, the expansion of the road into Buffington Harbor. I will tell you the comprehensive plan, there was a cost associated with that. Additionally, we also know that the Corporation Council previously was paid as a contractor. At one point, the Department of Commerce director was paid as a contractor. That is not the case now. There was also legal fees that are associated with the day-to-day representation, special cases that come forward. A lot is handled out of our law department, but there are some matters that cannot be handled out of the law department. So I want you to be aware of that. And then the last thing that I would say is that, you know, recently I heard that it was my intent to leave the city with nothing. That, you know, I was just gonna clean everything out and leave. Well, this is evidence that that is not the case. Quite the opposite. We are trying to leave the next administration with a level playing field. And I would say that was something that Mayor Clay did not have. That was something that I did not have. But it's something that I think that the incoming council, incoming administration ought to have. And let me tell you my vested interest in the success of my successor. It is because for the last 8 years, we have worked very, very hard. And it would be shameful for us to work that hard and then to have someone come in and not have the resources that they would need to continue that. The blueprint that you saw from Dana, you know, we've all bought those bookcases that you have to put together. And they come in a box with instructions. And some of us pull it out of the box and we read the instructions. Most of the women do that. Others of us take the bookcase out of the box, they look at the picture and they're like, I don't know how to do this. And they start putting the bookcase together. And they end up having to use duct tape, put it up against the wall so it won't fall, and do a variety of things. That blueprint is simply instructions. And it allows folks to implement whatever measures they choose to implement. And you know, what we have been elected to do until December 31st is ensure that we are good stewards and that we govern the city. And this is why I thought it was really, really important to give you this detailed overview. And I hope that those who couldn't come are in fact listening and taking advantage of what we've done through the public access and Facebook Live. So that's it.
Thank you, Mayor. Anyone? Yes.
Madam Chair, I had some questions about the sale leaseback to start with. Who should I talk to, Brandon? Or, okay. So is it true that we only have to pledge the LDA and the lit funds, but the lit funds alone will cover the debt service because it's only $3.5 million a year, right?
Right, we're pledging both, but the revenue from the lit should be sufficient to repay the debt service.
So the LDA, the $6 million annually that we get from LDA will be available for use by the city?
That's correct.
Okay. And does the 4.7 that you said the lit is annually, does that exclude the public safety portion that we can't use?
It does. That's only the economic development portion.
Okay. And let's see if oh, you mentioned that you gave us all the Dropbox proposals. Was that, when was that?
That would have been in August of 2018.
When we passed the other in October of 2018. So that would be August of 2018. Okay. And so you explained that the expenses are only going to be 1.2 or 1.1 million.
Right.
But we heard before at the council meeting that it was going to be 5 million off the top for expenses, but that's not accurate?
That's not accurate.
Okay.
That was the cost of issuance plus the reserve.
Oh, plus the reserve.
Right.
So that included the one, but that's still,
So the reason there's a difference is there's something else that's a little bit more complex called a discount.
Mhm.
So if you remember, I told you the coupon is 6%, but the total rate you'll pay is 6.3.
Mhm.
That difference is because you're borrowing $40 million, but you're receiving about 38.5. So you get 35 in the general fund, plus the cost of issuance, plus the debt service reserve, add up to about 38.5.
Mhm.
And so, but you're repaying 40 million in principal. So in that principal and interest that I told you, that was 67 million,
Mhm.
that's where that difference comes in.
Okay, so the 1.2 and the 1.75 will be that is our reserve, plus this differential you're talking about comes up to the 5 million
That's correct.
in cost? Okay.
Yes.
And because I thought I heard that we were just having 30 million in the pot for the city.
It's 30 million this year, and then the 5 million that the mayor referenced and Curtis referenced in the next year that the next administration will be able to draw upon. So it's 30 this year and 5 next year.
Okay, so we'll use 30 and it will pay off all of it will be used to pay off the debt,
That's correct, as well as bills and other
operating
other
expenses.
expenses.
And, let's see. So what revenue will the city have if we take away our lit? We'll have our property tax revenue because we'll be able to pay back the TAWs, is that?
Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out what we're gonna have to work with.
Sure.
If you can scroll up. You have all of these other revenue sources back the other way, I'm sorry. One more. Right there. So you have property tax revenue that you still have available.
Can you
have-
magnify that a little bit?
It won't matter for me, that's all right.
It's on your sheet, you have it
Yeah.
here.
It's on that
So
side.
if you go to the fourth sheet in what you have in front of you,
Mhm.
you'll see the revenue sources that are available.
Okay,
Yeah.
it's on page
The
4.
fourth sheet in.
Okay,
You have property tax revenue, auto and license excise revenue, commercial vehicle excise revenue, any commissioner's tax sale distribution revenue, building and permits revenue, air pollution operating revenue. It's all in that sheet that you have.
okay.
That's what you were saying, you're being very conservative
Yeah.
still over those revenues.
Yeah, we're being conservative from a revenue perspective.
Right.
And more robust from a expense perspective.
How would it happen that we wouldn't be able to cover the debt service with just the lit? What would the scenario be that we would have to dip into the LDA?
It would have to be a decline in Lake County's local option income tax, which isn't just based on demographic shifts in Gary. It would be based on the entire county, which has been trending up.
Okay. And the final question for you, Brendan, is I appreciate the explanation of why the lien, that would have been helpful before we came to a vote, but I wanted to make, it's legal to put a lien on a public building?
Yes.
Mortgage on?
And on my counsel, I would say yes, but my counsel is here, so yes.
Okay. Okay, I imagine you checked that. Okay, that's all I have for you. I do have a question about the 2019-36, the ordinance about U.S. Steel. Who do we have for that? Joe, good. I think I understood basically what you're proposing, but the question that I have is, we take this initial payment from U.S. Steel, and then And then at some point you said then we'd have 45% of, then we'd
Yeah.
get 45% of our tax revenue from US Steel. I mean, we only get 45% of that. Like, when does that kick in and how long does it happen?
Sure. So, first, separate the $20 million. That's a separate transaction outside of the TIF.
Okay.
So at the beginning, we start the TIF, we do our development and bond agreement, and we get an advance of $20 million from US Steel. Okay, so that's the first component. Normally.
Can I interrupt for 1 second? So is that advance in lieu of taxes?
Yes.
Okay, got it. So it's, okay.
In a sense, right?
Right.
Now typically, or in the past, I'll say, a lot of TIF deals are done based on their future tax income, right? So Truck City is a good example. Centier Bank, Dalton Arms.
Mhm.
They put a bond out based on what they think they're gonna generate. That, then the proceeds from that bond go back into the project to make them whole. And as they pay taxes, the bond gets paid off. We're splitting that revenue in half. We're saying.
Splitting it with US
And that's
Steel.
the 55-45. So
Okay.
first, US Steel's made whole on the separate $20 million advance, the payment in lieu of taxes.
Mhm.
After that point, we're gonna share the revenue 55-45.
For how long?
For the life of the agreement, 25 years.
25 years. Okay, 55, 45 for 20 years, okay. Okay. That's the only question I have for you then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other council members? Questions, comments?
Councilman Brown, I had one question about the 2.5 million. I know it was talked about US Steel being interacting with the city, with being on boards and putting some money to a special revenue fund there. I would like to see if US Steel will be willing to help us with more projects where it's equipment that we need desperately in so many different departments there. Our parks are in shambles and so many different areas. There's so many big need that's needed inside the city. If US Steel can help us, because there's a $2.5 million here that I know US Steel is taking for issuing another city. But if it can be designated to a source where we can see the benefits from, not just going to the general fund, but if US Steel can stamp their name on this project here, this park, these police cars, these general service equipment, they can stamp their name to this, where we can actually see the benefit, where these dollars have went. I would like to see if we can work something like that out.
And I think that's an excellent idea, and that was a conversation that you and I had
Yeah.
prior to that, and if there's someone who can address that, I don't know if there's somebody who can address that, because that's extremely important to the community, that those kinds of things happen, and that they know and that they can see what kinds of projects US Steel is doing for the city. Is there somebody who can address that, or wants to, or is willing
I
to?
mean, Councilor Brewer, just, if you can just, what you're saying is the money, which funds are you talking to?
The 2.5 million after the split, I believe like a $2.5 million difference, that US Steel would take. If that money can be earmarked to a certain project or projects, where if the city can just lay out certain things and US Steel say, okay, I like this, let us fund this, where we can put US Steel, this is the contribution that US Steel have made to the city of Gary.
I think what you're referring to is the $50,000 to $100,000 per year to the community development fund. Is that the money that you're talking about?
No, because that's only 100,000 now. If we go back to, I believe it's the 55-45 there, inside the presentation, they say it's like a $2.5 million gain that US Steel would get out of that deal there. If
The split's like 27 and a half, 22 and a half, so he's talking about the difference between a 50-50 split versus a 55-45 split, and that $2.5 million. That's what he's talking about.
And I'm not asking per se that the city have control of those dollars, but they go to a certain project inside the city.
Project,
Yes.
right.
I guess the only, I'll speak for you at risk here, but the reason there's a difference, it was 50-50 was the original agreement. But then came the idea of the upfront payment, so the $20 million upfront, which essentially US Steel has agreed to make that payment and not seek a direct interest rate on that money, okay? So that's why the split went from 50-50 to 55-45, just to kind of accommodate the time value of money. So they're giving $20 million up front. US Steel is going to receive their increment over 25 years. So that difference is just solely due to the fact that there was this large upfront payment to account for the time difference in money.
So are we saying then that large upfront payment, that we would be able to do some of those kinds of things that you're talking about anyway then?
No, not inside that,
Not at
not
that
the way that
point,
it's
right?
laid out inside the financial plan. It's not laid out that way.
So if both the sale leaseback transaction and the US Steel transaction happens, it is envisioned that largely the sale leaseback will be able to be used for operational costs, but the additional infusion of the US Steel dollars will help us to do CapEx projects in a way that we have not been able to do for years.
So what would be the dollar amount that we would be allowed to use?
Out of the 15 million, we can use.
This year, it's estimated at 1.8 million. You scroll down, I think next year is about 2.4 million, zero the following year. Keep on one more, 3 million following the year after that. It's these numbers here.
I'm hearing you saying that, but we're taking out a TAW at the beginning of the year to start functioning
Yeah,
inside
those
the
would be
city.
a little different.
Yeah.
And you would repay them at the end of the year.
Right.
So these are the dollars that Dana's talking about that would be available for CapEx expenses in this year and in future years. That's about $9.7 million
And
over the
Mr.
next 4 years in this year.
Madam Chair and Mr. President.
Yes.
I just want to, I understand what the President is suggesting. There are two things I want to raise. One is that if US Steel decides next year or the year after that or the year after that that they're not going to make that 750 million total, we still get the 20 million. So there is a guarantee with this that would otherwise not exist if they were to do it over the course of time. The second is that if they just did the investment in the way that is traditionally done, we would be still in the hole. So I'm not saying that your suggestion does not have merit, but I'm also saying that we have to consider what we've gotten. Essentially, we've gotten a $20 million loan at 5%. And we can't get that anywhere.
Yes, less
And Council,
Yes.
Council President Brewer, also, the cost of capital alone on $20 million is a lot higher than the 5%. So the risk involved is really why you see that difference there, as the mayor was talking about. So this is an unusual process. I don't think we've ever done this anywhere else. In fact, I know we haven't, and I don't believe that too many companies have done this. It's kind of, we were trying to be creative and create a real win-win between the city and US Steel, and that's where we came up with this. So, we've pledged to be involved in projects up to $100,000 each year in Gary, and we're going to do that. And we're going to be involved in other boards, and I've talked to the mayor about helping with blight, using some of our equipment, even the city purchasing some of our equipment that that we don't have need for. So we want to help in those ways, but that money is there for the cost. It's the consideration. It's the cost of the money, and really it's below what we could go into the market and make on $20 million.
Well, I understand and I support it 100%, but as I look towards my residents and that I represent, the conversation comes up that US Steel has not been there for the city for many years, and we all can agree to that. But I think it shows a good faith to this community that US Steel is here. US Steel is not going nowhere. US Steel is committed to this community. This city is founded because of US Steel, and I think it'll really be a good faith if US Steel can really do a little bit more. I understand what this deal is, but just talking to the average public, I can't sit in someone's living room and try to explain this to them where they can understand this. But they can understand if those kids are going out around the block, down the street, to a nice, well-kept park. General Service Department can go out with pride and have equipment that we definitely need to meet the needs of residents, and go in and cut lots, tear down homes, whatever that need may be. There's a need for this community, and I can't ignore that the need is not there, because it is. And we face that reality every day in this community here. We have bills waiting to be paid. Some of these funds are appropriated, and it's gone, pretty much. And we don't know what may happen as far as what may go on inside this community when we may need even more and it's not there. But there are some basic things that we just really need inside this community. Yeah. So that's my request. So. But I do understand the agreement and everything. I'm for it. I've been working with you all with the agreement for a long time, so yes, I understand.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So, this is 50 to 100,000, I guess, from the city's perspective. What are the plans for that? And this might tie into what you're saying, so that the general citizenry can see U.S. Steel is making contributions to the community. Are those dollars, can those be used for certain things to, clean up a certain park or?
The fifth, one of our water parks last year, when our pool was out of compliance, it cost over $100,000.
Okay.
We don't have not one pool ready to go where our kids can go. Towson Park is one of our major parks, and that's the Marquette Park. It's not a top-notch park like you will see in some of your surrounding communities. And it's hard to try and compare what we're preparing for our kids in the summertime, and I know it's not right. I know it's not right. It's not the park that you would normally just turn your kids loose and just say, there you go. We got $27 million that was invested in Marquette, and there's certain amenities that they had to do out there to Marquette, but there's still certain things that needed out there for kids just to be able to enjoy themselves. It's just not there.
And what did we say about capital expenses? Because those are the kinds of things that you're talking about.
Well, capital expenses, Councilwoman right here in her district, she has seniors from several programs out there. There's no air in there.
Right.
And we know how hot it got inside
Right.
that one pavilion.
Right.
That's just one. Towson has leaking
Yes.
roofs and other issues in there.
Yes.
We can go down the list throughout every district that there's a great need for just some of the basic things where the residents can
Right.
resonate and see what's taking place.
And
Yes.
to answer the question about the 100,000, it's contemplated that will be distributed to organizations like the YWCA, the Urban League, other nonprofits throughout the city through a nonprofit board. So that wouldn't be necessarily used for cleanup of parks.
Okay.
It literally would be a community fund.
Okay.
Great. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Any other council members? Mr. Moore?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Question for Brandon. You mentioned that there would be an interest rate of 6% on the 40 million.
Yes, sir.
Is that rate firm?
It is pretty firm, yes, sir.
So it could go
It's
up?
not variable.
No, it's firm.
It's fixed.
It's firm. It's fixed.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, it's a
Whatever
fixed
it
rate.
is, it's
Yeah, I'm
fixed.
sorry. I didn't
Okay,
understand.
I'm familiar with fixed, but I just want to know if it had been agreed upon that it is 6%.
Yes.
Anybody else? Yes.
So is that 6% or about 6%? What is it?
The coupon is 6%. The yield, or we would say the actual interest rate, is 6.3.
Mr. Nowacki?
Yes, Madam Chair. The two ordinances that the council is entertaining, there's really two provisions. One is the lump sum payment. The other is the taxes that the U.S. Steel will be paying going forward with their $750 million investment. Now, we've had a lot of graphs showing that scenario. But the easiest graph to see would be if the city simply allowed the U.S. Steel to make their $750 million investment, what would be the tax liability for the company without the giveaways and taking advantage of the city? What would their, and I'm sure the professionals have that number right at the top of their head. How much would U.S. Steel pay City of Gary, other taxing bodies, if we simply say, make your $750 million investment and pay the taxes, without having these, taking advantage of our debilitated condition here and trying to get the tax rebate, the tax abatement, and all the rest of that? What would U.S. Steel pay on their $750 million investment to all the taxing bodies, including the City of Gary?
It's $34 million would be the number over 25 years. The city is about 55% of the tax base of that $34 million over 25 years. That's about $18.7 million over 25 years. So that's less than $1 million a year that would flow into the city's coffers. Yeah, and it would. So if we take 15 million out of that, you looked at these quite well. If you take 15 million out, I'm now 15 negative. All right. If I take 18 over 25, I get something less than $1 million, maybe about 800,000. I plug 800,000 in each of these years. The city can't make it. Can't survive.
You're saying that over the term of this tax abatement, they would be paying
less than $1 million.
$18.7 million.
Yes.
Without a tax abatement.
Yes.
Okay.
Pay $34 million.
All right.
The city 18.7.
All right. Thank you.
55%
Okay.
of 30.
Okay, finally, the last item on the agenda is CPR 2019-05, and that's the resolution. I don't know how we're gonna.
Yep, is that the EDC resolution?
Yes.
Okay, so this is, the Economic Development Commission met earlier, and actually I should mention that there's updated documentation from both the Planning Commission for the previous ordinance and the resolution in front of you from the Economic Development Commission. They voted to enact this transaction essentially. So this resolution says that we're taking the recommendation of the EDC, the Economic Development Commission, and saying that we agree with it and we're willing to proceed with bond agreement, development agreement associated with it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. If there are no further questions for council members, no more comments, those are the last items on the agenda. Yeah, those are the last items on the agenda. So the meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.